Good evening. Good evening, and welcome everyone. I'm Crystal Collins-Judd, the president of Sarah Lawrence College, and I am delighted to welcome you to this year's Bozeman Lecture. The Bozeman Lecture is an annual event at Sarah Lawrence named for Adda Bozeman, who was one of Sarah Lawrence's most esteemed faculty members and scholars. Adda taught international relations at the college from 1947 to 1977. She was a prolific author, published several full-length books and numerous articles. Her extensive range encompassed comparative studies of cultures, legal systems, and foreign policies. In other words, Adda Bozeman was the model of an engaged Sarah Lawrence faculty member who influenced her field and opened the world for her students. I very much enjoyed over my years at the college meeting Adda's former students and her colleagues throughout the years at this event, hearing their stories of her influence on their lives and their careers. And it's been a special pleasure to get to know Adda's daughter, Anya, who is with us here tonight. So we are delighted to have Anya with us. Adda's impact on Sarah Lawrence and those she met and worked with here is evident in many ways, not least of which is the Adda Bozeman Chair in International Relations, which was established by a group of donors, former students, in her honor. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our current Adda Bozeman chair holder, Philip Nielsen, a faculty member specializing in the intellectual, cultural, and political history of modern Europe, with particular emphasis on German and Jewish history. His research addresses the history of democracy and its relation to emotions, constitutional law, and architecture. One of the pleasures and privilege of holding the Bozeman Chair is of organizing each year the annual Bozeman Lecture. And so my thanks to Philip for his work in arranging tonight's event, for bringing Jodi Rudoren, editor-in-chief of The Forward and former bureau chief of the New York Times in Jerusalem from 2012 to 2016, to campus. So I'd ask you to please join me in welcoming Philip, who will introduce Jodi, and they will start off in a conversation for this year's Bozeman Lecture. Thank you all for being with us.
Now it works, okay. To follow up on Crystal, I would like to welcome Jodi Rudoren, the editor-in-chief of The Forward since 2019. And before that, the New York Times for 25 years, including the mentioned stint as the bureau chief in Jerusalem office from 2012 to 2016, where she covered two wars, previous wars with or in Gaza. We'll talk about sort of terminology in a moment too. And has, though, worked many other stints within the New York Times. Before that, we just talked earlier about she's been to 47 out of the 50 states, covering a...
Been to all of them. Byline right. From 47.
Bylines already.
Also, only 21 years at the New York Times, because I'm not that old.
Okay. Apologies.
I started when I was 12.
Okay. We're very grateful to have you here tonight to talk about the challenges in reporting of the war in Gaza or between Israel and Palestine, or Israel and Palestine, right? Sort of terminology is something we'll address in a moment too. And I want to say sort of this shows like the flashpoints of the war, and we know there's a parallel event going on as well, right? The nature and devastation of the war and the growing death toll have made it charged in a way that other military conflicts haven't quite. I mean, if we think about reporting from Ukraine, we don't have quite the same conflicts about reporting, at least not in the US, so not quite as strongly. And so one thing I'm really grateful for that we can talk with you, right, about actually also the logistics and the technicalities and everything of reporting and, more about how media so works. In terms of a run through, like how this is going to go, is that Jodi and I will have a conversation for about 30 minutes or something, give or take. And then we'll open it up to the floor more generally and to questions to her. I want to just sort
of... Or to you.
Or to me, that's true, to both of us. This is sort of a space of conversation, so if you have a question, I would just ask for two things. One is that it be a question rather than a statement so that we can actually have a conversation. it can be controversial, right? So we can talk about pretty much anything. We talked about this before. And that you be in respectful in tone, right? Those are kind of just the two limiting factors, really. And you stick maybe to the engager or the speaker in her area of expertise, maybe the media, right? We'll have another panel to talk actually about the history of sort of Israel-Palestine in about 2 weeks. But now, so we really want to talk about media. And understand that media and politics are very intertwined in this moment. But I think we'd gain more from engaging you on the media side here today. And with that, actually, I would like to sort of start with our conversation on sort of the issue of technicalities, right? So, no, I lost my notes. But not in the order that they're supposed to be, which is a classical rookie mistake that a good journalist that Jodi Rudoren is, I would never do. And where we are here. Oh, it disappeared. No, here. Okay, I got it. Sorry, apologies for that. But we have this question of language, of framing and media, but really, with the media, I want to start with the material conditions of reporting from Gaza in particular. We'll talk about reporting from other parts of the conflict as well later. So I'm an historian, as I mentioned. I'm ultimately interested in the way things work, right? How ideas operate, but how we get news, how sort of reporting is done, how they get to us, and so how reporting in Gaza is done. Right? We know that this war has been devastating for journalists in Gaza. I think as of March 27th, so of yesterday, according to Committee of Protect Journalism, 95 journalists and media workers were confirmed dead. 90 of them Palestinians, 2 Israeli, and since they include the wider conflict, also 3 Lebanese, numbers injured, missing. In addition to that, Gaza has actually been closed to foreign correspondents. I think of note one, Clarissa Ward of the CNN managed to go in sort of not embedded with the IDF, but actually with the UAE in December. Otherwise, if you go in, you can go on sort of guided tours essentially, but you can't do independent reporting. So there's also been a petition and an open letter, late February, of 55 journalists and then 30 news organizations to ask to be granted access to Gaza for reporting and for the guarantee of the safety of local journalists from the Israeli military. And so, since you've reported from Gaza in the past, I'd be grateful if you could run us and work with local journalists, run us a little bit through the way that reporting worked in the past and sort of how it works now, considering these constraints for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the president for being such a gracious host and to Adda's daughter as well. And thank you all for coming. So I'm really glad that you started out with this question. I feel like this often comes out kind of as a wrinkle in a longer conversation, but it's so important. So as you said, I covered the wars in 2012 and in 2014, which, you know, in the hindsight from this particular perspective seem just so small and they almost seem like skirmishes. The war in 2012 really was small. I mean, it was an air campaign that lasted 8 days. I was there for the entirety of it and actually a few extra days after the truce. I spent Thanksgiving there, which was weird. And then in 2014, a war that we all thought was going to be very similar to 2012, or maybe a little bit like 2008-9, you know, turned out to be what was then considered unbelievably devastating, more destruction than anyone could have imagined. 2,000 Palestinians killed. The fact that 75, I think 67 actually, Israeli soldiers were killed in that war was also like, nobody could fathom that at the time. So to now see, like nobody could have imagined that there would be a war that would be coming on its 6-month mark with the number of people killed, the much larger number of people starving, the number of people displaced in Gaza, the level of buildings that have been destroyed. I mean, it is really kind of, the scale and the length of it is so outside of the parameters of what so many of us, people who have been doing this conflict for a living in diplomatic ways, security ways, journalistic ways, it has been paradigm busting. And one of the things that people don't talk enough about is this exact question of what has it meant for people's understanding of this war and what's happening, that for the first time, there is no independent journalism happening on the ground in Gaza. So how it worked before, and 2012 was a little different than 2014. Well, it was not different in structure, but it was a little bit different in terms of safety. In 2012, we all went into the territory on the first day of the war. Most of us were staying at the Aldira Hotel on the coast. There were briefers would come to the hotel, which was sort of like our newsroom as well as where we were staying, and give us briefings in the lobby of the hotel. And our safety it seemed, everything, there were air raids, but they were never going to be, there were airstrikes, but they were never near where international journalists were staying. One of the challenges was we all worked with local journalists, reporters, fixers, photographers, and they generally had to go home at night to places that were less safe. And it was always a dilemma, an emotional dilemma of what to do in that situation, how to handle that situation, those relationships. I think it was in 2012 I had a person fill in for my regular fixer because he had something else he had to do. And it was someone who was really a translator, not a journalist. She'd never worked as a journalist before. And she was in a car, behind a car that something hit. The people in the car in front of her were not killed, but it was extremely terrifying in that moment of this idea that she was very young. She was sort of my responsibility. She wasn't, someone who had trained as a journalist, or her family wasn't prepared for that experience. And that memory, which feels, I know it feels quaint talking about that now. I feel weird talking about this situation that was so much less chaotic, right? And then in 2014, we had the same basic structure in terms of international journalists were able to come in and out. We had people. I actually spent most of that war. It was 51 days. I spent the first. It's a long story about why, but I spent most of it directing coverage from Jerusalem. But we had correspondents on the ground in Gaza the whole time, and I was there myself, I think, twice towards the end. In that war, we were in touch with the IDF a lot about, is it safe to drive to Rafah today? Is it safe to, and they were less forthcoming than they'd been in 2012. They said, we can't guarantee, we don't know, maybe yes, whatever. It was a little more difficult to get information. And in that war, there was a ground invasion as well as airstrikes, and there was in that war things like the UN schools where people were sheltering were hit. There were some of the same kinds of things we've seen in this war with the hospitals and with other things that were hit. So what's radically different about the coverage of this war, I would say, is two things. One is the lack of access for international journalists that you mentioned, and the other, of course, is the direct reporting on social media from Palestinian journalists in Gaza, as well as Palestinian citizens in Gaza. And of course, some people are sort of hybrid citizen journalists. I think one of the people with the most followers of anybody in Gaza is Bisan. I think she's not a formal journalist, but is clearly acting as a journalist and is one of the chief storytellers of this war from the ground. So but as you said, the only international journalists who've been allowed in are coming in on embeds and short embeds, and so they're not at all seeing they're not having a 360-degree view of what's happening. They're having only a view from the military's perspective, and I think what that means, there are two ways that has been really, really bad for the storytelling of this war. One is that the basic thing that an international correspondent does is they partner with a local journalist on the ground who really knows the situation, who knows the players, who introduces them around, and who also is very much usually experiencing whatever's happening in that place, whether you're in a conflict moment or not. But the conversation that happens between the international journalist and the local journalist is sort of critical, because the international journalist is getting from their local partner the deep local perspective, but they're also bringing to their storytelling other perspectives and other experiences, and connecting it, therefore, to their readers' experience in a way that makes sense for them. The second big problem with this is that it has meant that for, and this is less relevant to the work that I'm doing now, but very relevant to what a lot of you are reading in the New York Times or the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, which is that the storytelling that's happening in those places, which generally involves, dozens of people, is sort of bifurcated. You have generally Arabic-speaking reporters who are spending all of their time working with local journalists or sources inside Gaza. They're communicating with them, social media, WhatsApp, whatever, and that's their 100% of what they're doing, is in Arabic on social media or in conversations with people on the ground. And then you have other journalists who are maybe doing some of that, but also doing mostly like the diplomacy work, the what is happening inside Israel work, Israeli politics, Israeli aftermath, volunteer efforts, Israeli soldiers, et cetera. So it's more split than it was in the wars that I was covering. When in 2014, the group of us were all kind of rotating around more, and it was more often that me or one of my colleagues would be doing a story that had inputs with local reporters from Israel, from the West Bank, from Gaza, and they were all kind of coming together in a more 60-degree view. So that's the, I think, chief downside of the lack of embeds, the lack of independent reporting, and it really needs to change. I mean, it's really, really problematic. It is also, of course, and the death, the killing of all of these journalists is, devastating and horrific, and the numbers are higher than they've been in similar conflicts, and it's really outrageous. We can talk more about social media later, because I realize that's a long answer to a short question.
No, thank you. That's very sort of useful, right, to think about also how, bifurcated, or what kind of reaches what kind of media outlets and how it operates, right? Sort of that.
I do think that some of the larger outlets are working against that tendency, but it's like you're just sort of stuck with it. I mean, and it's a natural way to break out the work. And when you have an international correspondent going in on the ground, and it changes that. So that's the real, I think that's the biggest problem with coverage of this war.
Right. So somewhat following on this, but the question on exactly the coverage and sort of what kind of narratives we're getting and sort of who is on the news, right? There's been a sort of sustained reporting now also on questions of bias, right? Sort of in terms of media reporting, and that there have been various studies done, like on how many Palestinian voices we hear, how many Israeli voices we hear, how many just American voices we hear. I think one large takeaway from one of these studies is that I think in the Sunday news shows, I think the overwhelming was Americans, right? Like neither Israelis nor Palestinians, and then there are some government Israelis, and virtually no Palestinians sort of presented on that. And so here too, like with a forward study, I think it's sort of it's a question then of kind of diversity of voices, and again, not only sort of on the Palestinian side, also the Israeli side. Through that, and I wonder kind of what you think about media coverage and sort of following up now more on what, not the reporting only from the ground in a sense, but what you see sort of in the media landscape in the US in terms of voices, what you see most as missing, right, sort of in that sense.
Yeah, I get asked this a lot, and I think I constantly give totally unsatisfying answers, so prepare yourselves to be unsatisfied with what I'm going to say. First of all, I'm really interested in the way you frame this question about like the Sunday news shows, which is like a thing that nobody watches anymore. So, like, no, seriously, I don't know. It seems so not at all to matter to me who was on the Sunday talk shows, which I didn't see that study, and I haven't watched a Sunday talk show in a really long time, although I do sometimes read articles about what people say on them that gets them in trouble. So I think one of the things that I think we want to just remember is that it's 2024 and we live in a democratized media landscape and a filter bubble world. So first of all, my first reaction to the question of like, what do you think of the coverage and what voices you're hearing is like, I'm hearing every possible voice all of the time. Most of them are screaming, which is too bad. I feel like there is no shortage of voices, and that the hierarchy, that the old way, the way I grew up, frankly, in this business, of there being this very important hierarchy that the Sunday news shows and the front page of the New York Times and this and that, that those things were so important. And so the great glory of our era is this democratization where you can, really everybody is being heard or at least is talking. Now, the great disaster of that democratization is that it's impossible to navigate. A lot of it is crap and like literally disinformation, and that it's very hard it's chaotic and it's loud and people are screaming. But I guess I would say that my experience of the sort of mainstream media coverage of this conflict versus this war versus its predecessors has largely been one in which I feel like more voices have been heard and more good journalism has been done. I'm a pretty devoted listener to the daily podcast, and I think particularly in the fall, the number of episodes that they devoted to this story was remarkable, and they were deep, long profiles of, more recently, there's a great episode about after the convoy disaster in Gaza about what people were eating in Gaza, how they were finding food. There was another, early on in the conflict, there was an unbelievable interview with a guy, I think his name might have been Golan, who was like a core rescuer at one of the kibbutzim on October 7th. So, and I also have been listening to a podcast out of Israel called Wartime Diaries that again is just like, it's just conversations with individual stories. So I feel like, I think the Times also did, I've been really struggling with the the things I don't know about the Palestinians who've been killed, but they did do a thing on Palestinian children that had it was interactive and had there've been a bunch of short documentaries on and video investigations on all of the big news organizations. So, there's plenty to criticize, but there's a lot to sort of absorb and hear. I think, everybody has a YouTube channel where they're putting their stuff directly out there. It's not journalism really, but there is a lot of access to voices and experiences. And I know one of our challenges is definitely to when everybody can kind of find their own things wherever they want, what is the role of the journalistic filter, curator? What is the role of editorial judgment? We think our biggest responsibility is really to help provide clarity amid the chaos and help curate and guide people through all that's available to them. But I guess I have actually been impressed with the volume and diversity of the voices, although I've read some of these studies of analyzing language and analyzing numbers, and I hear you. I just think it's always about sort of how you define the lens. I will say one thing, just one more thing on bias, and we can probably go deeper into it, which is just to say, this is the part you'll really not like, so prepare again. No, it's just, I guess I would just ask you to consider that people who are deeply invested in the outcome of a storyline, particularly when that investment is core to their identity, may not be the best judges of bias in media. And that I really implore or request that the journalism and the media be judged on its own stated goals. So if the goal of the New York Times coverage of this story is to provide a 360-degree view of what's going on so that people who otherwise would know nothing about it will have some reliable, trustworthy, truth-based source to understand its complexity, judge it on that versus judging it on, are you advancing the cause of blah? And I think it can be hard to do. I'm pleased to be on a college campus tonight. I often, in my current role, end up speaking at synagogues or JCCs, and it's usually an audience where people are on many email listservs where they get from Jewish advocacy groups where they are getting a lot of agenda-driven information, and it can be difficult after reading 10 of those to then look at a journalism newsletter or website and not see this seems anti-Israel, since everything else that you've just gotten is from an Israel advocacy perspective. And I think the flip side is probably also true. So I would just ask you to consider that bias, of course there is bias everywhere, but activists have like stated clear biases, and so their judgment of neutrality and independence and truthfulness may not be the most reliable.
Actually, is a sort of I want to get back to that sort of in a little bit later, but right now, sort of actually, I had this question for you about what you see as the task, as the editor of the Forward, actually right now, right? You answered already a little bit and said, okay, I'm sorting through sort of media and thing, but I've listened to this. Alan Rusbridger and Leila Barber have a wonderful podcast sort of on media. And they had Mona Chalabi on recently, who was one of, very critical of some of the Times coverage, as much as he admires the Times and works with a Pulitzer Prize winning data journalist. And she sort of said something along the lines that, like, usually, and I think I'm quote, is trying to communicate information, so what she thinks of her as a journalist, in a way that actually directly addresses injustice. I don't think that reporting I'm doing in Israel and Palestine right now is going to be achieving that. Our work has drifted more towards the work of frankly becoming historians. I'm trying to capture the facts as accurately and as honestly as I can for future generations. So that kind of is sort of her take right now on what she's actually doing as a journalist. You gave us slightly evidence, and I'm sort of curious, right, about how you think about the work at the Forward right now.
Thank you. It's a great question. I mean, so I spent my life, I worked at my high school newspaper and then at my college newspaper, and then I started at the LA Times as an intern a week after graduating, and then I got hired at the LA Times, and I worked there for 6 years, and then I worked at the New York Times for 21 years. All of which is to say that this is, and then that those are all obviously big, secular, national news organizations, and then I decided to leave the most successful news organization in the world, where I had a very robust career, and take a big salary cut to work at a very small nonprofit, which is maybe weird to do, but anyway, that's a different talk. And this is my first job in what's called Jewish journalism. People asked, I'm Jewish, and people asked me a lot in my prior life, what is it like to be, a Jewish journalist covering Jerusalem or the conflict? And I was always sort of like, I don't know. I mean, it's like, what's it like being a woman? It's just who I am. But this is different. Running a Jewish news organization in this moment is very different from working at the New York Times. And it's been something that I've been, I don't know if struggling is the right word, but I mean, obviously thinking about hard. In the beginning, there was this really interesting phenomenon. I mean, we and a lot of other news organizations, both in Israel and Jewish news organizations here, I mean, we had this significant uptick in our audience and in our engagement, and also in our sort of profile. I was on TV a lot talking about the conflict because of my experience before. And it was clear that people like really, really needed us. There was a lot of American Jews who were really certainly shocked by the events of October 7th, very engaged in the aftermath from all perspectives, from anti-Israel to hardline, Israel right or wrong, and also felt unclear about they were newly questioning things about like their allies in the left or their neighbors, and so we were very much this idea of like we're really the only non-ideological Jewish news source in America, except for the wire service Jewish Telegraphic Agency. So I think we were a place where people found, as I said, clarity amid the chaos, but they were specifically seeking out like a Jewish space to engage with this story. And that felt very meaningful, and then it also felt kind of fraught. And I definitely struggled after having, worked for many years in the secular press with, at what point is it right for me? I write a weekly column. And just for me personally, from the beginning, we've been covering some stories, publishing opinion pieces by Palestinians, publishing stories about the Palestinian experience. Not a huge number of them, but we have always had them. But I was one of my big questions was like, when is it right for me to write about Palestinians in Gaza versus Israelis versus American Jews, and how often and in what way? And that's been something that it was an issue in the early days. I think I found an okay balance. And right now, the last few weeks has been, I think, another time where it just feels like, the sort of incalcitrance of the Israeli side of this story, and it's just a very difficult challenge. We published a story, an opinion piece, maybe 10 days ago. It was a doctor from somewhere, I forget exactly where she lives, but she had gone on a humanitarian mission to Gaza, and spent, I think, a couple weeks there. And we did a sort of as told to piece of her experience. And, it was incredibly important for us to publish that piece, because we really need for American Jews to hear that voice from a source that they believe is from their community. Similarly, I wrote a column, I think in January, this is actually a really nice story. I wrote a column in, I think, January about one of my former fixer reporter partners in Gaza. Her sister had decided she wanted to leave, and she was doing a GoFundMe. And her sister had a particularly tragic story of losing a baby right before the war. And so I wrote a profile of them and her effort to get out. I think 200 forward readers contributed to their GoFundMe and raised something like $13,000 or $14,000. And she just got out on Saturday, and I spoke to her last night, and she's in Cairo now. So that's what my column will be tomorrow, is about her again. So, we can do, but it's different. It's not the same. It's not the same mission as the New York Times. But I mean, our perspective is we are an American Jewish publication whose primary audience is American Jews, whose primary coverage map is the Jewish American story. But we believe that those people and that story includes the whole story as much as we can.
Thank you. So I'm a German historian. I work on German Jewish history, but German democracy, and sort of Germany has a very different set of regulations about sort of free speech in a way, kind of what considers hate speech, what is considered acceptable democratic discourse. So as a result of the sort of post-war West German constitution, to the extent that parties can actually be outlawed if they are challenging the constitution. Holocaust denial is a criminal offense, which actually is its own big debate at this point. Sort of
Isn't it even
Germany.
like even saying the word Nazi or swastika?
No. You can say all these things. You can't have any Nazi symbols.
You can't have a swastika.
Exactly. You can't have the symbols, but you can talk about. I mean, historians otherwise would be screwed. But sort of,
and
you can
Holocaust
have
denial is a
Holocaust
crime.
denial is an offense, exactly. And so now, that's one of the big debates, and I'm curious, a little bit I want to talk about this kind of in the debate.
I actually wrote a story when I was in Israel. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I wrote a story in Israel. Somebody proposed a bill to basically do this in Israel, to make the things that were illegal in Germany illegal in Israel, and it failed.
Right. And so here, right, sort of, it's kind of contested in Germany too, both from the right and now, in different ways too, on the left. But what I'm curious about something like you're, and I see this in your columns, and you're like a big defender of sort of free speech, and sort of fairly, robust in that, I want to say. And now you sort of gave an indication of the kind of stories you started to run more, right, sort of in the forward that you might not have run half a year ago. And I was wondering sort of where the limits are, you think, and kind of what you wouldn't run anymore, maybe that you'd run in the past, sort of the negative story to kind of the positive story you just told now.
Yeah, I mean, so I think what I was trying to say before is actually really simple, which is this storylines evolve. So what people need to know about and how they need to think about it and how they should understand it on October 7th and on October 15th and on November 15th is not the same as on March 15th, So that's, I was giving some talk where somebody was saying, like, it's not complicated. October 7th is not complicated. I'm like, okay, but a lot has happened since October 7th. So that's the first part of it. I mean, I think this is a great question. I'm actually recruiting our opinion editor left at the end of the year to do some advocacy. And so I'm hiring for an opinion editor. And one of the questions I had on their homework is like, what are the boundaries of the big tent? even though I think talking about boundaries sort of undermines the whole concept. But I was like, who would you not publish? You know, how do you define diversity of opinion? So I think about this a lot, and this just came up like yesterday, 2 days ago. I don't remember the specifics of the incident, but somebody was fired from their job for some advocacy, and I think it was a journalist, and one of my editors wanted to know, should we reach out to the person to tell their own story? Maybe we would publish the story. And they said, I'm looking at the person's social media right now to sort of background them a little bit. And they sent me a post, and the post was, the 6 different things that they say never happened that we know happened, and on October 7th and since. And it's like, yeah, we're not going to publish people who deny what happened. I just heard today, somebody told me that Ron Dermer, Netanyahu's former ambassador to the U.S., who's a member of the War Cabinet, he was doing a meeting, I guess, with a bunch of American Jewish leaders yesterday, maybe, a phone call. And he apparently denied that there's starvation in Gaza. So that's, the same standard. You don't, so I think denial is, denial, disinformation. We are in the truth business. We're in the truth business. Truth can be murky, has been getting murkier. Obviously, in the opinions section, the question of what's true, what's somebody's true experience gets a little more complicated. Actually, I got a text last night from a guy I think is really, really smart, who we've published a bunch. It was about that Gaza doctor piece, and he texted me and he said, just curious, honestly asking, do you fact check a piece like this? So, he's not obviously just curious. This is a challenge to the piece. And I said, well, how are we going to fact check what this woman's experience was inside the hospital? Did she actually treat this? We don't have access. There are not actually records. So what do? We are assessing the author or the source that we're interviewing about their trustworthiness. Do they seem to have a consistent story? Do they have facts that sound like facts? Do they have details that are relevant? Do they have pictures that support what they're saying? But, there are some times where you can't independently fact check, so you're sort of trying to figure out, like, is this a person whose narrative we can trust for at least its own frame? I don't remember now what your question was, so I can't tell if that answered it. I'm sorry. But yeah, like it can be, but yeah, anyway, I forget. Free speech. Yeah, all about it. Love free speech. Look, that to me, there's obviously 2 big storylines happening here. There's the storyline there, and there's the storyline here on places like Sarah Lawrence, and also at our Thanksgiving or Passover tables. And also, I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago about protests that were happening at my town, and there's also things happening at local school boards and local city council meetings. And I'm terrified about the shrinking space for serious discourse. The number of news organizations, newspapers in this country, and working journalists in this country has declined by about half in the last 15 years. The number of the existing news organizations that are independent ideologically is shrinking. And the spaces on college campuses where people engage in rigorous discourse, difficult as it may be, is also being compromised. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. It's happening. Professors are being sanctioned for what they say. At Barnard, you can no longer have a whiteboard on your dorm door, which is a tragedy of its own. And I think this is terrifying. I think it's terrifying. So I'm very, very concerned about it. I think a lot of speech is ugly. And I think ugly speech is, I feel stupid saying this in a university setting. You all know this. But the First Amendment is about ugly, offensive speech. It's not about, like, nice, happy coexistence, huggy speech. It's about hard speech. The thing that makes this country great is we protect minorities, minority opinions, and we protect each other. We, protect the space to have hard conversations. that's what it's about. So I'm pro.
Okay. Actually, sort of, I mean, this seems to be, I have a question that, but I can keep for the moment, actually, speaking of language and sort of actually, again, sort of coming from this angle of German, you know, what you can say, what you can't say. The big debate in Germany right now, to give you a segue, I'm going to ask this question, then we open it up, because otherwise yours was a nice segue for opening it up, is whether or not, and how you can compare the Holocaust to genocides or colonialism more generally, right? So not even I'm for now on a table sort of about this, but sort of more generally. Again, sort of in the context of Holocaust denial, in the context of German history more generally, right? So this is the big stumbling block in a way of kind of how we talk, and there's a lot of censoring happening actually in that case sort of in Germany about this, sort of where questions about comparability become sort of questions you can't ask, right? Because as an historian, I would say, well, you have to ask kind of questions and kind of compare. That doesn't even equate, right? So it's not the same thing. I'm actually reviewing right now a book by the historian Andrew Port. It's called Never Again, who studies the way that in German discourse, sort of since the 1970s, really, which is the time that Germans started to think about the Holocaust more openly, broadly, their involvement, sort of as individual citizens in that, and sort of make that so that becomes the cornerstone. It actually coincides with the screening, speaking of media, of the miniseries Holocaust. So that's one of the pivotal events in '79 in Germany, and that overlaps with sort of the genocide in Cambodia. And so this is sort of the moment at which sort of comparisons of the Holocaust or the genocide sort of start creeping into the media to make sense of foreign policy, right? Which is deeply controversial, and then it happens later on. Now, so we're in another moment, right, sort of where it's deeply politicized, whether or not we use, beyond sort of legal and other implications too, right, whether or not we use genocide also in reference, either in, from both sides. I mean, I'm thinking of and Jonathan Glazer's speech, right, sort of who sort of used this film about the Holocaust, right, to warn about complacency, essentially, and passivity, but didn't, you know, say that what is happening is Holocaust, but we shouldn't use the history of the Holocaust in order to claim policies. On the other side, you have complaints, right? We should call this a genocide with its own stakes attached. Again, sort of added Jewish newspapers imagining this is an even more fraught discussion. And so I'm wondering, like, if this discussion is happening, how you lead it, right? Again, sort of at this, right, from either end.
Totally. I mean, I was gonna ask you. I'm really glad you just explained all that. I really wanted to ask you about sort of the German perspective on this, because I think there are two really interesting questions for sort of what does the German experts say. One is the one you just described. The other is there's a lot of American Jews who are like, we're in 1930s Germany. We need to be calling out. This is that moment, and I think. Maybe this is another talk where I get to ask you about how the historical parallels are to that, because I'm, you know, I don't even know what the question is. But anyway, look, I think that one of the first stories I did at that I didn't do it, but I was at the Forward early in my time was, it was during the thing at the border where there were kids being kept in cages. Do you remember this? So during this awful sort of, here in our border, sort of the Mexican border, family separation, and there was something about cages, I don't remember. Anyway, I think it was AOC, I'm not positive, who compared that situation in some way to the Holocaust or to I don't remember, honestly. And it was like, this is this catnip for the Jewish Twitter, and then to some extent for us. And it was like, right, there's this whole cottage industry among Jews of calling out people for using language and imagery that connects anything to the Holocaust, right? And this is like a big thing. People are very, very worried about any language that is appropriating Holocaust stuff. I get that, and I think it's also probably a little bit of an overreach, but it's a big phrase. Totally before October 7th, major franchise. So, look, I do think that the use of the word genocide very early in this war, and to some extent before this war, is not accidental. I mean, I think people understand that Israelis and Jews generally have a particular relationship with that word. Somebody earlier was mentioning that somebody was using the word pogrom. I think similarly, Jews have a historical relationship to that word, which is why I thought, actually, it's hard to remember this, but in February of 2023, when a bunch of West Bank settlers torched the Palestinian town of Hawara, a lot of non-right-wing Jews there and here called that a pogrom. That was a very significant thing for them to do. So I think that the question of how these words are wielded and used is super important. I mean, in terms of like my policy is like people should be able to use whatever words they want, and then we should debate them and see what they mean and why are they using them and what is the impact of them. You know, I almost always end up with some anecdote about my kids as I answer these questions, because a lot of the world gets worked out at our kitchen tables, right? So one is from this morning. My 16-year-old daughter, this morning, we recently went to tour Smith, sorry. Anyway, she might apply to Smith. She hasn't decided yet. And so she's like following Smith on Instagram, and she saw that the Smith SJP was doing a sit-in, and they're calling for divestment there of, it's more, I think, more specific about gun companies that provide weapons to Israel or weapons parts. And then they also have a very long petition. So first she's summarizing it for me, and she says, she said that one of the demands is that they want professors to be required to use the term genocide. And I was like, I don't think that's right. Like, that doesn't sound right to me. And then we looked, and it was in fact that they wanted professors to be allowed to use the term genocide, which obviously those are pretty different. So I think, like, you know, that's my feeling, is we should not require people to, and I also, so one of my core principles is to be pretty radical about free speech. Another core principle is to try to avoid purity tests or litmus tests, or like you get to play if you say this word or condemn this person or whatever. I think that's also a bunch of like performative crap. I will also say, in October, this same daughter texted me one night. I was traveling, and she texted me, and she said, doesn't genocide have to be intentional? That was like her, you know, she was starting to see on social media people talking about genocide as part of this war. And it didn't make sense to her from what she had learned about the genocides that you had talked about. It did not seem to be in the same category. You know, there was an international court hearing that essentially came to that conclusion, but also said this story's not over yet, and this story's not over yet. And I think that, you know, language, along with the story, our understanding of language and the use of it needs to change too. I do think that, I don't think this is the only conflict where this happens, but the word genocide is hardly the only term in this conflict that is corrupted and weaponized and distorted by people in every activist group. I've written now twice, once at the New York Times and once at the Forward, about conflict code. And the genocide is not a good example of this, but words that have sort of a meaning that we understand in English and a whole different meaning when activists in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are talking about it, are using them. And it's part of the way that long before October 7th, activists who I think were understandably quite troubled and upset about the sort of stagnancy of the situation had taken to sort of attacking. There's like a separate war that has nothing to do with the actual war, that's all about attacking journalists personally, attacking journalism, and creating this idea that if you said a certain word, it meant this other thing that you didn't even know before you started.
Thanks. That was, again, so I would wish we had the time for the conversation about,
Are we in 1930s Germany?
Well,
I mean, you should
don't
really
think
tell
so.
us if we are.
No, I don't think so. I mean, not there. Well, anyhow, it's a long conversation. But maybe some of it will come
I
up
mean,
in the
here we are
questions.
having this conversation, so I'm guessing we're not. Like,
Exactly,
at least not in
exactly,
Bronxville.
exactly.
We're
I think
okay
that's
today in
Right.
Bronxville.
But I would like to open it up now, since I can have asked at least most of my questions, not all, and you had to sit through them and answer them as rambling as they were. I would like to open it to the public now, and we have somewhere microphones going around. And I would ask you to please use the microphones, considering that we both have a Zoom audience, and so it's just easier to hear. And then
People should just raise their hands in their seats.
I think so, and then we have them going around. So there, then I have
We have 2 microphones, it looks like.
in there, then we have some hands up here. All right, I have a somewhat, and then sort of here, and we're walking.
All right.
All right, and then we have here, noted.
Okay. Someone who has a microphone, ask a question.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming today. I just wanted to ask, especially with the article that came out Tuesday about the hostage who was raped and, is now freed. I was wondering, like, with your experience in, like, Israeli journalism culture and also as a woman, like, how you think it will go or should go in terms of, like, these women and protecting them and, like, protecting other women and just, like, in general. Thank you.
So one more thing, actually, as you ask the question, if you could briefly introduce yourselves, I think that would be great, just to kind of know the perspective you come from.
So just for people who don't know, the question is about a New York Times article that was published on Tuesday about an Israeli lawyer named Amit Susana, who's 40 years old, was abducted from Kibbutz Kfar Aza on October 7th and spent 55 days in captivity and then was released, I think, on November 30th, which is my birthday. And one of the reasons I know all of that is because I literally was editing an op-ed about this at 5 o'clock. So anyhow, so she is basically the first person, surviving person, to tell a detailed story about being assaulted sexually, in her case, during her captivity in Gaza. Her story is of a lot of sexual harassment and repeated beatings, and she describes one incident in particular where she was forced to commit a sexual act by her captor, her guard. And it was a lengthy account. It was also it was with her full name, it was with her picture, and also the New York Times verified that she had told the same story to 2 doctors and a social worker within 24 hours of her release, which is a sort of, in the coverage of sexual violence, is generally an important part of reporting to sort of, there's always a question of, was there contemporaneous reporting to either friends or doctors or officials? So it's certainly the most detailed and most credible account to come out of sexual violence really throughout the war, but certainly in Hamas captivity after, a lot of discourse that is presumptive or based on much less evidence. So, I mean, I think and she was the story was immediately really vilified and denounced online. People just said she was making it up. It was fed to her by security officials. Why did couldn't she have made up a more unique name for her Hamas captor, who was or Hamas guard, Mohammed? I don't believe any women. I don't believe, especially Zionist genocidal women. A lot of very ugly denunciation. I mean, I guess what I'm grappling with still, and honestly quite confused by, and literally was just discussing with this writer this afternoon, is exactly why and how the kind of weaponization and denialism of sexual violence in particular has played out here. But there's a bunch of factors to it. I mean, we of course had, it took a while to figure out or prove or whatever that there was sexual violence on October 7th itself. And there were a lot of good reasons for that. First, just chaos. Second, the mass number of casualties that people were dealing with. It seems clear that most of the sexual violence was committed on people who were later killed, so there's not a lot of live testimony. Then there was this whole period in which, almost all the international feminist groups who normally are very involved in denouncing sexual violence were quiet, and then that stopped, and then we, now have had this UN report confirming sexual violence on October 7th, and now there's also a lot of rumors about sexual violence among the hostages, as well as rumors and accusations of IDF soldiers committing sexual violence while in Gaza as well. And I honestly don't know what to make of all of it. I mean, I think sexual violence has been used as a weapon of war in many, many places. It is not a surprise that that is happening. It was a surprise to me in November that women's groups were not standing up to talk about it. And that story largely seems over to me, and yet I constantly hear from Jewish activist groups, pro-Israel groups, about the silence of UN women and the silence, which is not true anymore. And I think it's we should really move on from that. It's not the story today. And I think, I think, I'm very grateful to my former colleagues at the New York Times for, it's a difficult story to get, to publish, to handle, and I think I was impressed with the story. I think they said they did 8 hours of interviews with her, which is a lot. And I guess that this is a little bit of a theme, but I think that the extent to which the attacks on journalism and journalists is a particular weapon of this war that I worry about. I think that we actually need, maybe I should we should back up to the basics. Here's my real position. We really need to know what's happening in the world. I'm sorry, but we really need to know, all of it. And that's what journalism's about, and it's what history's about as well. I deeply believe that functioning democratic societies depend on a strong, independent press that can tell you what fuck is going on all around you and in places far away. And they need to tell it as fully, as fairly as possible. And it's our responsibility to support those institutions, because without them, we are truly screwed. The world is a complicated, messed up place, and we need brave journalists who will go to difficult, dangerous situations. You said 96. I had read 126 of them have been killed covering this conflict. We need them, and we need people to believe their work, because otherwise we will have look at us. We're sitting here comfortable in this lovely place, and tomorrow many of you will go to teach or study in classrooms and learn things. And much of what you will be learning has something to do with some witnesses or journalists who were there at the time. And we don't really have any idea what is happening there without independent journalists who will tell us. So, lots of questions.
Oh,
This guy has a mic.
thought he was pointing towards the guy on the mic. Yes.
I'll try to keep my answers shorter so we can get more of your good questions. Sorry.
Go ahead. Okay, fine. Yes, thank you for addressing us. I just wondered if you had any idea as to what Hamas hoped or expected to achieve from the invasion.
I've interviewed a lot of Hamas officials and leaders in my time. They are not generally the most trustworthy people. While you're interviewing them, you're you're lying to me. That's also true, by the way, of many politicians of other organizations, including ones here. So I don't want to overstate my understanding of their agenda. Look, I think it's true that Hamas and Israel know each other very, very well. So it is certainly true that Hamas totally understood that this kind of attack would trigger a devastating response. That said, nobody could have imagined this devastating of a response. It's not in anybody's consciousness that this kind of war could go on for this long and be this, I mean, there's like, it's never happened before. And they all thought they knew, I mean, nobody's ever breached the fence before. No, I mean, all these things are new. My column on October 9th was headlined, "Everything I Thought I Knew About Israel and Gaza Was Wrong." And it's not because I'm an idiot, it's because everything we all thought we understood was wrong. Hamas did something Israel could never have imagined, and now Israel is doing something that Hamas could have anticipated, but in a way that it never would have imagined. So what do I think it thought it was doing? I mean, I think that I do believe that the narrative or the analysis, let's say, of the extent to which the Palestinian question had dropped from the Arab agenda and the international agenda was devastating for Hamas in particular, but really all Palestinians. And this was a somewhat, I mean, this was I don't want to say desperate, because I think it was, you know, obviously a significant achievement in terms of their capacity, but it was a like a Hail Mary, I guess. And I think they, you know, in that way of, I mean, we're all talking about it now. And so, what do I think they hope to achieve? I mean, I think that the breaching of the fence in itself was a massive achievement for Hamas and actually for a lot of other Palestinians as well. And I think it, you know, I heard somebody say very early on that, like, the people we saw celebrating on October 7th, that it was mostly about that idea. I mean, you know, you've been in a siege situation for a lot of time where a hostile enemy country controls your travel and your trade through this fence. The pushing through of the fence is a very significant thing, a liberating thing. So I think that was certainly one goal, was to just prove that they could do that thing. I think they obviously wanted to kill and abduct Israelis and other people who were in Israel. And I do think they wanted to, or they knew they were going to trigger a devastating response in terms of Israeli attack on Gaza, that would certainly keep the Palestinian struggle in the forefront of the international conversation. I don't think that the narrative of, like, they want people in Gaza to be killed, they do not want that. They may not care enough about that. I mean, they are willing to accept some number of people in Gaza being killed in exchange for their achievement in their quest to fight with Israel.
Hello. Regarding, you were talking
I just want to
about...
get back to, nobody introduced themselves.
I'm sorry. I'm Jamie. I'm a student here. You talked about the importance of, like, clarity and language in reporting. I wanted to ask you a question about a piece that you published for The Forward earlier this month called "When Hate Comes to Your Hometown," in which you equated anti-Zionist chants, as what you said, like, most similarly to white supremacist rallies or neo-Nazis. I was just wondering, what do you think, who do you think this reductive and very one-dimensional portrayal of political action both benefits, and also how does this framing affect many Jews like myself, who are both not white and also anti-Zionist, as similar to white supremacists and neo-Nazis and anti-Semitic?
Oh, so I think you misunderstood the column. So what I said in the column, so what the column was about, I live in Montclair, New Jersey, and there was a protest, there were dueling protests actually, and in the pro-Palestinian protest there was a chant, we don't want, say it loud, say it clear, we don't want no Zionists here. And what I said was that I was trying to imagine what other group, any group of protesters would say, we don't want no X here. So I wasn't comparing the protesters or anti-Zionists to white supremacists or Nazis. I was hearing it, I was trying to imagine who else would be acceptable to say, we don't want any X group. And so I was saying, like, a lot of people in my town were like, they're saying we don't want Jews here. And I was like, well, they're not saying that. They're saying Zionist. Zionist is a political philosophy. As you say, many Jews are anti-Zionist. So I was like, who else would it be acceptable? Not like, it's not going to be illegal. I mean, it's obviously acceptable to chant it, but like who else would either this group or any group say, we don't want anybody of this stripe in our town? And I was trying to think of other political philosophies that might be banned from a town. Like, we don't want any socialists here. We don't want any vegans, I think I threw out. And it was very clear to me that, like, the only other thing that you'd ever really say is, we don't want any white supremacists here. We don't want any Nazis here. And so that's what I said in the column. And what I actually then, I think, went on to say was, this is reminiscent, of course, of the march in Skokie, where there was a neo-Nazi march in this very heavily Jewish town, and the ACLU protected their right to march there. It was a Jewish lawyer who led that case, and a lot of Jews who were active in the ACLU protected the neo-Nazis' right to march. And I think that's one of the proudest moments in American history, is protecting the neo-Nazis' right to march in Skokie. But in any case, I wasn't saying that anti-Zionists are anything like white supremacists or Nazis. So that's just to clarify. But the question was, well, how does, I'm sorry, what was the, I'm not sure if the question's relevant since the premise was not quite right, but maybe it's a different question.
I guess I'll adjust that to fit more into what your framing is. But when you, especially for a Jewish audience, compare being anti-white supremacist and anti-Nazi to being anti-Zionist.
No, but I'm doing the opposite. I was saying that the anti-Zionists were
comparing
comparing Zionists
to
Nazis and white supremacists, which I think is what they were doing.
That's what I said. I meant to say comparing, like, being anti-Zionist, like the same diction is used. I guess my question is, how does framing something that may seem rational, like being against white supremacy or against Nazism, like that was your comparison for the same diction being used. What is the purpose of bringing that up in conversations of talking around or elaborating anti-Zionist protests for a Jewish audience?
Again, just to be clear, what I was saying was that I was realizing that the folks chanting, we don't want no Zionists here, think Zionists are akin to Nazis and white supremacists.
Yes,
which I think is like actually, I mean, there's many examples in which some anti-Zionists frame Zionists as parallel to Nazis or white supremacists.
So my question is, in doing that comparison of the different kinds of diction, what is the purpose of them framing the rationality of these protests? Because I think that language is very charged, especially considering the audience that you're publishing to.
I mean, honestly, I was like writing a column about my experience, but so I'm not sure I thought that much about. But I mean, I think it's important for people to know that. I mean, I don't know whether the people who were chanting "We don't want no Zionists here" on the street corner were like, I pass and my kids pass all the time. I don't know if they think of Zionists as akin to Nazis or white supremacists. I was struggling to think about what other group of people they would say we don't want to live among or we don't want allowed on our town square. So the framing of it was an exploratory, like, search. I was doing a thought exercise to walk through what they could be talking about. And I guess in terms of, I hadn't thought about it this way until your question, but I guess it's probably important for our audience to understand that that's how people see Zionists.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've been very concerned about UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency that's been in Palestine for about 45 or 50 years, I'm not sure. I'm Marcia Brewster. I used to work for the UN. So there was this report from UNRWA that perhaps 10 or 12 of their staff members had links to Hamas. So then
No, the report said that 10 or 12 staff members from UNRWA participated actively in the October 7th attacks, and that something like 10% of the overall staff in Gaza may have Hamas affiliations.
But that UN report, that I think it was a suspicion. I don't think it was verified. But then the Israelis made it as if everybody in UNRWA was connected to Hamas. But what my concern is that then everybody stopped funding UNRWA. And, you know, that's the only lifeline that the Palestinians had. And so I just can't, and I think the Israelis did blow it up as if it was much bigger than it was. And also, in President Biden's budget proposal that came out yesterday, 0 was asked for UNRWA for 24 and 25. And I'm just wondering how does that advantage Israel? I mean, UNRWA is really important to keep these people alive.
I mean, this is a great question. It could be the topic of at least one seminar class, so I'll try to be brief. So UNRWA is a unique agency for the Palestinians. There's a separate refugee agency for all other refugees in the world. And one of the distinctions is that Palestinians, all descendants of Palestinians who fled or were forcibly removed in either 67 or 48 or ever since, are all considered refugees. So the reason I start there is because that truth is one of the issues that Israelis have with UNRWA, because it means that the refugee question for Palestinians is of a magnitude that is demographically very, very significant in terms of the potential end of the conflict. So that's one point. The second thing is that UNRWA in Gaza has a particularly powerful role in the society there because a very large percentage of the residents of Gaza are refugees. And therefore, UNRWA, I mean, and particularly since Hamas, in a violent coup, overthrew Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in 2007, sorry. UNRWA is like the government. It's like the second government in Gaza. They run, I don't know the updated numbers, 60, 70% of the schools, of the healthcare. So, I had my kids went to school with the kid of the head of UNRWA in Gaza when I was there, and people called him the mayor of Gaza. It was like him and Ismail Haniyeh were running the place. So it's a very strange situation. It's it's not comparable. And so one of the other big bugaboos is, the textbooks in UNRWA schools have a lot of insightful or anti-Semitic stuff in them. By the way, Israeli textbooks also have a lot of hateful, Islamophobic, and anti-Arab stuff in them. And, it's like people spend a lot of energy on this, and it is not going to help resolve the big questions. So now we come to the situation that you're talking about. So I actually am a little out of date, so I have to look into this. I wrote a column after this about this, in which a very wise Washington insider laid this out for me in a very interesting way, which he might have been wrong, but here's what he said. He said that neither Biden nor Israel wants to defund UNRWA right now, because the humanitarian situation has gotten so much worse since that moment, but it was without UNRWA, you're really screwed in terms of doing anything. And the funding of UNRWA is a very controversial topic in Congress. And so what this person told me, apparently, so they made this big statement that they were going to suspend the funding for UNRWA, and then 17 other countries followed suit or whatever. it affected like $300,000 because like 97% of the allocation that had already been approved had already been given to UNRWA and spent. So what this person told me, and you can read my column if you want, was that the idea here was to make a big fuss over this now so that UNRWA could then fire these people, make a big reform, whatever, so that they could then get a new allocation that would be meaningful. Now, if you're telling me news I don't know about Biden not putting any money in the budget. I don't know. He might have just been wrong, or that could also just be a Washington tactic that he's not putting any of the money in, but this appropriator is gonna. So let's like keep watching this. I think it's a good question. It is definitely a bad idea to defund UNRWA right now. I mean, that is not going to help anything or anyone. And UNRWA is an agency that is filled with problems as well. And like, you know, I mean, when the killing stops and the war stops and the hostages are released and the food gets into Gaza and we start rebuilding buildings and Israelis have a new prime minister, like then like sure, let's talk about UNRWA when we get there, you know, but it would be low on my list of things to worry about.
Hi, I'm Emmeline. I'm a student at Sarah Lawrence. At a time like this, when people have vastly different definitions of words like apartheid, genocide, Zionism, and phrases like from the river to the sea, and honestly, even some Jews have differing definitions of what anti-Semitism means, how do you, as an editor of a prominent Jewish magazine, deal with that, and how do you define and contextualize these terms for your readership? Also, I love your work. I get the forward in my email inbox every day.
Thank you. And oh, I forgot I have postcards if people want to sign up for our newsletter, but we'll get there. Thank you very much. I mean, what a great question. That was really a good question. First of all, I do think that your list of words, if I got it right, apartheid, genocide, Zionism, anti-Semitism, let's start with those four. I mean, I do think that, like, I would split those into two different categories, right? I mean, I think that apartheid and genocide are legal terms that have pretty clear definitions. One of the things, I think it was in 2021 that Amnesty International came out with its report saying that Israel was, actually, they didn't say it was an apartheid state, they said it was committing the crime of apartheid. And it was this incredibly, like, detailed thing that related to international law. And as I said, we had the ICJ case related to genocide. Like, there is a lot of literally, like, documented definitions, and then there's a lot of experts who, in court cases, et cetera. So I would put those two in those categories, and I would try in my own editing or writing to adhere as much as possible to, like, the actual definitions enshrined in law. I think with Zionism, I might even split up Zionism and anti-Semitism, because there's this, I mean, one of the stories that I like least in the last 5 years is this debate over the official definition of anti-Semitism storyline, this IHRA definition. Like, this is truly a boring conversation. I'm not going to have it. But so there's even like a lot of stuff written about like the official definition of anti-Semitism. Zionism is like a thing nobody knows what that means. Every single person and actually that was a big part of my column about Hate Comes to My Hometown, was looking at that question of like the way that the word Zionist has been really corrupted and weaponized by people on both the right and the left. The you know, right-wing Israeli government refers to Zionism in a way that would not at all make any sense to American Jews here. And one of the things that I found out was that like, we have no idea how many, we actually know much more about how many Americans and American Jews consider themselves anti-Zionists than we know about who considers themselves Zionists, because pollsters don't ask the question about, are you a Zionist, because they realize that nobody knows what it means. And, you know, like the woman I interviewed at the Montclair protest, about the Montclair protest, she's like, I forget her exact words, but some version of, you know, Jews have a right to have a state, a Jewish and democratic state in Israel. I also believe that Palestinians have the right to have sovereignty in Israel. You know, that's her definition. I also I've never written about this, but I have this document on my computer, because I years ago tried to do a story of like, what do a bunch of interesting different people define Zionism as? So I sent out a bunch of emails, and I've got and it's like, I can't make heads or tails of it, honestly. So I have no idea what Zionism means, and we, But look, I mean, I think, and I guess I have a couple more things on this. One is Deborah Lipstadt said something very interesting. The anti-Semitism ambassador, she said something very interesting in probably was in October. She was talking about anti-Zionism. The question of is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic, on which you can look on YouTube for a lengthy debate I moderated between Peter Beinart and Bret Stephens 3 years ago. But is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? So she said something very interesting that I had never heard it said quite this way. She said, that question is different 75 years into the existence of a Jewish state in the land. Because to say right now, I think there should be no Israel, I think it should be dismantled, is a act against those Israelis, and 80% of whom are Jewish. So that I thought that was interesting. I mean, and so, but anyway, I find the word Zionist to be extremely troubling because I don't know what it means to everybody who says it. So I guess I try to push for people to explain what they mean, which is actually, to get to your actual question, that is really key in writing and editing, right? Is to get people to be as specific as they can about what they mean. This reminds me of another really important thing, which is one of my predecessors, James Bennett, as Jerusalem bureau chief in the New York Times. He was there during the Second Intifada, and he wrote this absolutely brilliant memo on when and how to use the word terror attack or terrorism. And he wrote, I'll give you it's really beautiful and brilliant, and it has been published. And you can find it linked in a couple of my columns, including one I wrote about him. But anyway, what he basically said was, he's like, at first, he said, my first answer was, don't characterize things. Go, report, describe. Say what actually happened. These people, these people from this group broke into this home, killed this person, they killed them this way. Let the readers decide. He said at some point during the Second Intifada, he started to feel that not using the word terrorism was more biased than using it. And so he found himself, and I think that was it's not a good answer because it doesn't tell you when to use the word terrorism, or any other word. But the basic idea that going and reporting and describing what happened is always the most important thing, giving the detail. What do you mean? What happened? What did you see? Start there. And then, there is some point where you do need to characterize things and then use it to be judicious and sparing. But I think when people throw terms around that you're not sure what they mean, ask them, what do you mean? Why did you ask them, Philip's question, why did you pick that particular term to use? What brought you to this? I mean, come to, don't assume they agree with you. Don't assume that they're doing it for some nefarious reason. Ask. We should have a student as the last question.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Dr. Edward Powers. I want to thank you for the discussion. Thank the president for having this. If I may have two questions. One has to do with what I would see as the reporter's dilemma. Okay, that they always talk about your source, okay, and preserving that source. So what if you're faced with a situation where the scoop you have is something that for the common good has to be reported? The editorial board says no. Do you go outside the editorial board? And are there situations when you can betray your source? Second question. Egypt maintains that border with Gaza is sealed, that nothing gets across there. And that you look at the amount of armaments and missiles and guns and everything that Hamas has, people say, well, they manufacture that underground. I still find that hard to believe, so I'd appreciate what your comments.
So
Thank you.
for the first question, I want to just say, I think you're watching too many journalism movies. I mean, it's just like 99.9% of what we do is like so far has nothing to do with any of the things you just said. So the like use cases where you have a secret source and they're telling you something that it's just like, I don't even know. I mean, we could go there, but it's so not the day-to-day how we work. We mostly are not in a situation where we would ever consider betraying the identity of a confidential source because we've made an agreement and their safety may be at risk. Number two, it is not a normal experience for a reporter to have like a massive dispute with their editor about the ethics of a situation. Mostly we work together and have shared values. So I'm gonna like kind of skip that because it's like the stuff of Hollywood. On the Rafah border, so I do think it's really important to remember that from 2007 until October 7th, and since October 7th, Gaza has been controlled and blockaded by two powers, Israel and Egypt. Egypt has not been helpful in day-to-day ways to Gazans' needs from 2007 until October 6th, 2023. The border, the surface border, the human border for crossings has mostly been closed. People have not been allowed to travel through Egypt. B, there is a massive tunnel trade underneath the Rafah border that includes some things that Gazans really want and need, and that's, I guess, in some ways good for Gazans, but it's all done on the black market, and also, if not weapons, materials that become weapons. So you are absolutely right to point to the complicity of Egypt in allowing, in two things. One is in restricting Gazans' travel and trade alongside, I mean, Israel is the sort of official controller of those things, but there is a crossing in Egypt that has not been open. And yes, the tunnel trade from Egypt is significant. And so it is a significant actor in keeping Hamas not just well-fueled in terms of weapons, but also like well-heeled in terms of all sorts of things. So yes, you are correct about that. I don't know, the situation right now at the Rafah border, I'm not 100% sure about. Like, I told you I just interviewed this woman who left through the Rafah border. Some like 300 people are leaving a day on the company she used. You had to sort of bribe the officials to get out. She said, and I have heard from other sources as well, there are aid trucks parked outside of the border that aren't being allowed in. Exactly how Egypt and Israel are in control of that situation, I don't know. Another thing that would be fantastic to get international reporting about.
We have time for one more question. Jodi made the good point that we should give this last question to students since we're in college.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Hank. I'm a sophomore here. And I think it's very interesting what you said about not knowing what Zionism means. Because I'm a student of history and politics, and part of my education here is defining very specific things like that, like Zionism. And I've also read some of your work, and in one of your articles, I apologize, I don't remember the name of it, but in one of your articles, you spoke about how Israel is our Jewish homeland to protect, and then said, well, you essentially lamented the idea of losing, as you said, Jewish control over Jerusalem. So in my mind, as a student of history and of politics, that is Zionism. And I was specifically wondering, I suppose my question would be, while you were writing that, were you thinking of Zionism and of for example, the Nakba, which created Jewish control over Jerusalem, which created the Jewish homeland in Israel, the Nakba, of course, being the catastrophe, I believe 17,000 dead Palestinians, as well as the 750,000 displaced Palestinians who were kicked out of their homes, forced at gunpoint, murdered, abused, and often raped. Were you thinking of the term Zionism when you wrote about the Jewish homeland that we have to protect and Jewish control over Jerusalem?
So that was from a column I wrote on October 9th, a column where I said that everything I thought about Israel and Gaza was wrong. And the column also talks about like the need for Palestinian state and Palestinian sovereignty and independence, as I've talked about in any number of columns. So look, yeah, so if you, I mean, you know, you didn't ask what like my personal definition of Zionism. I mean, I've never like when I was first asked the question of whether I was a Zionist, I said that the only ist I am is a journalist, which remains true. I'm not like a person who signs on to ists. I do think that, I mean, Jews have, had a presence in Jerusalem for thousands of years and in the Holy Land, as have Palestinians. There are two different peoples with indigenous claims to this territory. And I believe that, or I hope that there can be independence, sovereignty, and human rights for all of those people. I do think that the survival of, I think that if Israel can remain a Jewish state and a democracy, that seems okay to me. And I think the only way that that can be true is if there's an independent and sovereign Palestinian state and there's human rights protected in both of those states. That would be, that I don't know if that's Zionism or not, but like if I was able to wave a magic wand, that's what I would want. I don't believe that, I also kind of know that the alternative that some people present by national state, one state, whatever, is not really a place that the Israelis or Palestinians that I know from the time that I was living there and reporting on them want to live in. It's like a made-up place that a lot of activists have on paper. I also know that what will happen is, if there's a one state, call it a solution or whatever you want to call it, that's a place that, I mean, there are already basically more Palestinians than Israelis than Jews between the river and the sea. And presuming there would be a solution that would include the refugees, which that is essential to any solution, that would be a significant majority of Palestinians. So that one state solution is a state called Palestine. And that would be the end of there being not just Jewish control of Jerusalem, but a Jewish state at all. Look, my understanding, I'm not in the business of drawing up maps or deciding solutions, but I certainly cannot imagine any solution for this territory that doesn't include a shared control of Jerusalem, with a capital for both states and shared access to the holy sites. So I think that the phrase Jewish control of Jerusalem is, I think in retrospect I shouldn't have used it, but it is a phrase that really refers to the biblical history, really refers to the ancient times and the prior times when there was Jewish control or Judea control of this territory. There was a Jewish state at all, or it's not really right to call it a state. So I think I was trying to invoke that phrase because around 6 months earlier, around the 75th anniversary of the modern state of Israel, because of the depth of the democracy protests, a lot of people were talking about, like, would Israel survive to its 80th birthday or its 100th birthday? At that moment, many Jewish Israeli thinkers, American experts on the conflict, were talking about the existential threat to Israel's survival from within, and that Israel had created its own demise. So I was recalling that in that moment, in that phrase. I did not mean Jewish control of the whole city or Jewish control as opposed to Palestinian control of East Jerusalem. I just meant, like, would there be a Jewish state called Israel in the Holy Land at all? There have been twice before in history. This is a thing that the vast majority of American Jews and Jews around the country, around the world, take as a given and hold somewhat dear. And so in that moment, 2 days after the attack, yeah, I was saying, like, if you want there to be a Jewish and democratic state in this place, the conflict needs to be resolved. And you cannot, this is proof of that. There will be no Jewish state if the conflict continues. I've said that many times. I totally believe that. The most important thing that Israelis need to hear and their American Jewish supporters need to hear is it was true on October 6th. It's abundantly clear now. The status quo is not sustainable. The occupation is not sustainable. Cannot continue this way. So that's what that sentence was doing there. I think the sentence before it or something talked about the need to end the conflict. But I can certainly hear, as you read it back to me today, that it could, just as when a lot of people hear from the river to the sea, they hear the erasure of the Israeli state and of the Israeli Jews who live in it. I can certainly hear that when you read the phrase Jewish control of Jerusalem, you're hearing not Palestinian control of any part of the city they see as their capital. So it's a good note. I can't go back and, I guess I could go back and change it, but that's not the way it works, really. And yeah, I could have said that better. Thank you.
Thank you, Jodi, for both the conversations, very thoughtful response, and taking the time. And we didn't quite stick to our promise just to ask you about media, clearly. But nonetheless, thank you. But thank you for all the things. And I want to remind everyone who's here also, if you're interested, and on the 16th of April, we're having another panel on Palestine, Israel, with Saida Chan, Leila Farsakh, Peter Beinart, and Lee Ben-Chitrit. Where do we go from here? Where we'll have much more time to talk about what comes after, right? What are possible ways out of this? Thank you very much.
Thanks.